On the night of January 11th, 1988, a 62-year-old man named Wilfred Gaudreau ate a bowl of hot soup at his kitchen table in Kapuskasing, which was a tiny lumber town in northern Ontario, Canada. His 53-year-old girlfriend, Agathe Brichot, was sitting across from him, and she was visibly shivering because it was freezing cold inside of their house. Now, Wilfred knew Agathe probably wanted him to turn up the heat, but he absolutely was not going to do that because, as it was, their electric bill was already too high. So Wilfred really hated spending money, but not because he didn't have any. Back when he was a kid, his family had been really poor, and so he'd picked up some really frugal habits that had just sort of stuck with him. So even now that he had a steady income as a mechanic and pretty comfortable savings, he still always tried to spend as little as possible. Plus, he wanted to retire soon, and he was supporting Agathe too. So as he sat there watching Agathe continue to shiver, clearly trying to signal to him like, come on, turn up the heat, Wilfred finally did get up, but not to turn up the heat. Instead, he walked over to the living room and he grabbed a shawl off the couch and he brought it back and he handed it to Agathe. Then, as Agathe kind of scowled at him, Wilfred just sat back down and continued eating his soup. Early the next morning, around 7:15 a.m., Wilfred woke up to an empty bed and the familiar sound of Agathe bustling around in the kitchen, making breakfast and packing his lunch for work. And then a few minutes later, he felt the blanket shift as Agathe crawled back into bed beside him. So Wilfred and Agathe had been together about 12 years, and these days they lived a pretty quiet life, which was pretty easy to do in Kapuskasing, which was the kind of place where really nothing ever happened. And it's also where pretty much everybody knew everyone and where people didn't even bother locking their doors at night. And that suited Wilfred just fine, because at one point his life had been anything but quiet. His relationship with Agathe had actually begun with a huge, dramatic scandal. That scandal had cost Wilfred his marriage, most of his family, and a lot of his self-respect. So at this point, a simple life with Agathe was exactly what he wanted. Now, Wilfred lay in his bed just for a bit longer, listening to the wind howl outside and, feeling Agathe next to him. But eventually, he got up and he headed down the hallway in just his underwear. The sun was not up yet, so the house was completely dark, but he made his way to the bathroom by memory, and when he got there, he flipped on the light. He closed the door and then walked over to the sink and he turned on the tap, and he had just begun shaving when he heard the door behind him creak open. Now, Wilfred instinctively figured it was Agathe coming in to use the bathroom. But then he turned around and saw who was actually standing in the doorway. At the same time this was happening in the bathroom, Wilfred and Agathe's neighbor, Suzanne Gravel, was in her kitchen next door when she heard these loud crashes and shouting coming from Agathe and Wilfred's house. She ran to the window to look out, but it was too dark to see anything. It sounded like Agathe was screaming Wilfred's name over and over again, and so assuming there had to be some sort of emergency, Suzanne grabbed her coat and just ran outside to see what was going on. But she'd only gone a few steps out her front door when she looked over and saw the door to Wilfred and Agathe's house swing open, and a man stepped out. And this man was definitely not Wilfred. He was short and stocky and looked like he was maybe in his early 30s. And as he stepped down off the stoop, he turned and made eye contact with Suzanne, who immediately froze. Her heart was racing out of control, and she knew she was now in danger. But she didn't panic. She just turned and walked over to her car, she got in, and then locked the doors. And then she just sat there and waited. Now, the whole time that she did that she was just sitting in her car waiting, this short, stocky, mid-30-something man actually just continued to stand there in front of Wilfred and Agathe's house, and he was just staring at her in the car. But after a little while, he turned and walked over to the curb, and he climbed into a blue pickup truck, and he drove off without even turning on his headlights. The second he was gone, Suzanne rushed out of her car and ran back into her own house. And once she was inside, she immediately grabbed her home phone and she tried calling Wilfred and Agathe's number for their house next door. But the line just kept on ringing, nobody answered, so she eventually hung up and then she called the police. A dispatcher picked up her call, and just as Suzanne began describing what was going on, Suzanne, at her house, she heard this loud banging coming from her front door. Immediately, Suzanne thought that the short, stocky guy who drove off had come back for her, and so she was terrified. But then she heard Agathe calling her name from outside, so clearly it was her banging on the door. And so Suzanne, she drops the phone, she runs over to the door, opens it up, and there was Agathe, who had no coat on, and she looked equally terrified here. Suzanne grabbed Agathe, she pulled her inside, she slammed the door, locked it behind her, and then she looked at Agathe like, what's going on here? And Agathe, she's out of breath, she's clearly panicking here, but eventually she calms down and she looks at Suzanne and she says, something terrible has happened to Wilfred. About 20 minutes later, a constable with the Ontario Provincial Police drew his revolver and pushed open the front door of Wilfred and Agathe's house. He was here because the police had just been told that a violent assault had just apparently occurred in this house, and so this officer was here to check it out. And so this officer, as soon as the door was open, he shouted inside that if anybody was in there to come out with their hands up. And then when there was no response, he stepped through the doorway. As the officer went room by room, making sure nobody was in the house, he noticed that it was very quiet and very clean, like the house was immaculate and nothing was out of place. It didn't look like anything had even happened in here. Until he got to the bathroom. When he looked in there, all he saw was blood. It was on the walls, it was on the floor, it was everywhere, on the toothbrushes, the toilet paper. I mean, the whole room was splattered in blood. But most of the blood had pooled around the body of a man who was lying on the bathroom floor. The man was just wearing underwear, and he was lying on his back, and there was shaving cream on half of his face. And he was covered in at least a dozen stab wounds on his neck, on his chest, and on his arms. Now, the constable knew there was virtually no chance this man was still alive, but he obviously had to be sure. So he stepped into the bathroom, he crouched down next to the body, and he felt for a pulse. But there wasn't one. The body was still warm though. So the constable pulled out his radio and he called it in. And he also asked for instructions because Kapuskasing did not see a lot of homicides. And the constable literally didn't know what he was supposed to do next. A few hours later, so around noon on January 12, 1988, Detective Wayne Frechette of the Ontario Provincial Police stepped off a plane at an airstrip near Kapuskasing, where he'd just been made lead detective on a murder case. This town was so small that the local police didn't have anyone who'd worked a homicide before. So Frechette had been flown in from Toronto to run this investigation because he did have homicide experience. He'd been briefed on the flight and already had a good sense of the case. So Wilfred Gaudreau, the victim, was a 62-year-old mechanic, and he had been stabbed to death in his bathroom that morning. And right afterwards, a neighbor had apparently seen this short, stocky Caucasian man in his mid-30s walk out of Wilfred's house and drive away in a blue pickup truck. So, assuming that man that was seen leaving the house was the killer, it seemed like he already had a pretty big head start here because he had a decent description of the number one suspect, potentially the killer. He was also confident this had not been part of a robbery or just some random attack, because the first responders hadn't found any signs of a break-in or robbery, and the house had been basically spotless aside from the bathroom where pretty clearly the murder had taken place. So Frechette, he couldn't possibly know if that guy who left the house, if that really was the killer or not. However, there was one person he could turn to right now who could really help him figure out if this person could have been involved, because she'd actually been inside the house when Wilfred was being murdered, and so very likely at least saw or maybe even knew that man that was seen exiting the house. Later that afternoon, Frechette sat in an interview room at the local police station listening to Wilfred's girlfriend Agathe walk him through her morning. Now, according to Agathe, she hadn't actually seen the attack. She hadn't seen the potential killer, like none of it, because when she heard this commotion in the house, she had just sort of instinctively jumped into a closet and hid. And she had stayed there until she heard the sound of whoever this was leaving and driving off. Now, Frechette was not totally alarmed by this story. I mean, people get scared and they protect themselves. But what did stand out to Frechette as Agathe told him this story was that she didn't cry once the whole time she was talking. In fact, she came off as almost weirdly calm. Now, Frechette knew from experience this could definitely just be, a product of shock. But it also could be that she just wasn't that upset. So at some point, Frechette asked Agathe about her relationship with Wilfred. And she told him that by and large, they'd been really happy together. They'd hardly ever argued, and when they did, it was just about Wilfred being cheap. Because, as Agathe went on to explain, Wilfred would go to crazy lengths to save money, even just a few cents, even though he had plenty of money saved up. She said Wilfred would even watch the TV with the lights off just to save money on electricity. He also insisted on reusing bathwater for the same reason. And then when he and Agathe traveled, he made them sleep in the car rather than paying for a hotel. So Frechette, after listening to this, he felt like he was getting a picture of a guy in Wilfred who had strong opinions and really not a lot of flexibility. It did make Frechette wonder if maybe because of this personality type that he appeared to have, Wilfred, it's entirely possible he could have made some enemies along the way in his life. And when he asked Agathe about that, when he asked her, did Wilfred have any enemies, Frechette immediately saw Agathe's expression change. She went from being sort of weirdly calm to looking almost apprehensive, and she looked down at the table for a moment and then back up at Frechette, and then she just said, that she didn't want to point fingers here, but there was some history that he needed to know. She told Frechette that before Wilfred was dating her, Agathe, Wilfred had actually been married for 20 years to Agathe's own sister, Rachel Brochu. Agathe said that she and Wilfred had had an affair, and when her sister Rachel found out about it, it became a huge scandal that really tore the whole family apart. Rachel had divorced Wilfred pretty much right away, and she was still very angry about it, even now, 12 years later. This was a deep, deep cut. And according to Agathe, Wilfred's son, Paul, had taken the whole thing really hard too, and he'd barely spoken to Wilfred since the divorce. Until recently. This past Christmas, Agathe said Paul had come to Kapuskasing for a visit. It had been a pretty awkward couple of days, but she said that Paul and Wilfred had actually really bonded in the end. And Paul seemed to have, basically forgiven his father. Frechette wrote all this down, but he wondered how sincere Paul's forgiveness really was. It was definitely suspicious timing, and on top of that, Paul was also in his early 30s, which was the exact age range as the suspected killer, that guy who walked out of the house that was seen by the neighbor. And so now Frechette really wanted to speak to Paul and also Wilfred's ex-wife Rachel as soon as possible. But just as he was wrapping up the interview with Agathe, an officer poked their head into the room and said they had just found something that Frechette needed to see right away. A half hour later, Frechette stood by the side of the road just a few miles from Wilfred's house, looking down at a pair of bloody winter boots lying in the snow. And then behind Frechette, a little ways up the road, was a team of police officers who were working over this blue pickup truck that they had found abandoned behind a paper mill. These two clues, the boots and the truck, were actually just the latest in a trail of breadcrumbs that the killer had apparently left behind. Because all day long, various reports had been coming in about this mysterious man who matched the killer's description. Around 8:30 a.m. that morning, so about an hour after the murder, this mystery man had been spotted in downtown Kapuskasing wearing a rain poncho, ripped pants, and no coat. He'd gone to a few different stores, buying boots, a jacket, and ski pants, and he paid for everything in cash. Then, around noon, a police roadblock had stopped a taxi on its way out of town. The taxi's passenger, who was a short, stocky man, apparently in his 30s, had seemed really jumpy, so the officers had checked his ID and recorded his name before letting him through. Just then, Frechette's radio crackled and he answered it, and dispatch told him that they had just finished running the plates on that abandoned blue pickup truck, and they had traced it to a man from Timmins, which is a town about 2 hours south. The man's name was Richard Boucher, and it just so happened that that was the same name as the jumpy taxi passenger who'd been stopped by the police roadblock. 2 days later, on January 14, 1988, Detective Frechette sat at a desk in the Kapuskasing police station reading the file on Richard Boucher. who was currently on the run from police as the #1 suspect in the murder of Wilfred Gaudreau. And Richard's file only made Frechette feel more certain that he was his guy. First of all, Richard was a Caucasian 33-year-old man, sort of fit the physical description, and he was also a cocaine dealer with a side hustle of providing strippers to local bars and hotels. And also, he'd previously been arrested for drug trafficking. However, there was one glaring problem, and that was that so far, Frechette just could not find any connection between Richard and Wilfred. Like, if Richard was the killer, why? How? Like, how in the world could these two guys be connected? The two men lived hours away from each other. They didn't seem to share any friends or business connections or really any mutual people at all. So to Frechette, it sort of left two possibilities. Either they were linked by someone or something that maybe Wilfred had kept secret, or someone else had hired Richard to kill Wilfred. So now, while the local police focused on just finding Richard, Frechette was trying to figure out who in Wilfred's circle might have wanted Wilfred dead. By this point, Frechette had already questioned Wilfred's ex-wife Rachel, and she definitely did seem very bitter about the divorce. But she said that she actually really didn't keep up much with Wilfred these days, and that she couldn't even begin to guess who might have killed him. Because according to her, Wilfred was like the most boring man on earth, and she had no idea who would want to do this to him. Frechette thought this was actually kind of an odd thing to say about your ex-husband who slept with your sister. However, Rachel was not the only person on Frechette's list that had a grudge against Wilfred. Because Wilfred's adult son, Paul, had been so mad at Wilfred, he'd basically barely spoken to his father in the past decade. Except for just this past Christmas, when Paul had visited Wilfred and stayed at his house. And that visit had taken place just 3 weeks before Wilfred was murdered, which struck Frechette as awfully convenient timing for Paul to have had this sudden change of heart. And Paul's visit would have given Paul the chance to learn the layout of Wilfred's house. He would have seen Wilfred's routine, how he moved around, and when Wilfred was alone. All information a killer would need to know before attempting to kill someone. Now, Paul did not live in the area, so Frechette had actually scheduled a call with him for that afternoon to talk all this through. And when Frechette glanced at his watch, he actually saw it was time. So he picked up the phone and he dialed Paul's number. When Paul answered, right away Frechette noticed that his voice was a little bit shaky. And also, pretty much immediately, Paul said, unprompted, that he very likely didn't have anything useful to say because he hadn't been close to his dad in years. So Frechette just asked him about his recent visit to see his dad this past Christmas. And Paul would confirm that yes, that visit had happened, but he said that despite it being a good visit, for the two of them, he claimed he couldn't really remember anything that they'd even talked about, like it was all just kind of a blur. Frechette did not believe this for a second. I mean, theoretically, this was like a meeting for the ages. This is a father and son who've been estranged for over a decade, and they're having this life-changing meeting where they're gonna reconcile. And apparently they did, and you don't remember what you spoke about? He just got the feeling that Paul was trying to say as little as possible here, like he was afraid that sharing too much might get him in trouble. Frechette continued to question Paul for a bit longer. He asked him about his memory of his father's affair and of his knowledge of his father's finances. Now, Frechette knew from speaking to Agathe that Wilfred, despite being incredibly cheap, did have apparently quite a bit of money saved up. But Frechette wanted to know if Paul knew about it. Because if Paul thought his dad had cash that theoretically could go to him in the form of an inheritance, well, that was a reason to make amends after all these years, or maybe even reason to commit murder. But Paul said he actually just figured his dad was broke and always had been, because it just sort of explained why he was so cheap, because he didn't have much money. That's at least what Paul thought. And so he said he didn't expect his dad to leave him anything. This answer made Frechette wish they were doing this interview in person, because over the phone, Frechette couldn't watch Paul's body language as he talked about his father's money. So he couldn't tell if maybe Paul was lying when he said he didn't know that his dad had money. But either way, Paul clearly was not giving him anything particularly useful at this point. And so now Frechette was starting to think that the only person who could tell him if Richard had killed Wilfred and why was Richard himself. The police just had to find him first. Two days later, on the night of January 16, 1988, Detective Frechette climbed out of his car in front of the Timmins police station and hurried up the steps into the building. After 4 long days in northern Ontario, he was tired of the extreme cold and was just ready to go home. But this murder case just kept getting more complicated. Until recently, Frechette had pretty firmly believed that his primary suspect, Richard Boucher, had been hired to murder Wilfred Gaudreau. Wilfred's ex-wife Rachel and his adult son Paul were the top suspects in terms of, people who might have hired a hitman, since they both had really good reasons to hate Wilfred. And then also Wilfred's girlfriend, Agathe, had been so calm in her interview, so she was also on the list as well. And she was also present at the time of the murder. But then Frechette had gotten access to Wilfred's bank statements, and they'd made him reconsider everything. Wilfred did have a lot of money saved up, that was true, just like Agathe had said. But his bank account had been steadily draining over the past few months. His bank statements showed big withdrawals spaced out in regular intervals, and Frechette had no idea where the money had gone, which made him wonder if Wilfred had been mixed up in something, like drugs or sex workers or gambling. Any one of those could explain the random chunks of money coming out of his account, but more than that, they could theoretically explain Wilfred's hidden connection to Richard, that sort of secret connection that maybe they had. And if those two did know each other, then maybe no one had hired Richard after all. Maybe Richard had killed Wilfred over something that was just between the two of them, like an unpaid loan or a deal that went bad. But now, Frechette actually had a chance to find out himself, because that afternoon, the Timmins police had finally tracked Richard down and arrested him. And Frechette had made the 2-hour drive from Kapuskasing to Timmins so he could interview Richard himself. Once inside, Frechette spoke to the officer at the station's front desk, and then quickly they had someone take Frechette back to Richard's holding cell. And when they got there, Frechette found Richard inside the cell, slumped over on the bench, looking exhausted and maybe strung out. His clothes were really dirty, he smelled terrible, and his eyes were completely bloodshot. Frechette entered the cell and sat down across from him, and as aggressively as he could, started laying out the facts. He told Richard that on the morning of the murder, like right after it happened, Wilfred's neighbor had seen Richard leaving the crime scene, and they would be able to pick him out of a lineup for sure. This neighbor also saw Richard's blue pickup truck, which had been found abandoned near a pair of bloody boots that were in Richard's size. Frechette said the lab was still testing the blood, but he was fairly confident that it was going to come back as Wilfred's. Frechette told Richard that with all this evidence, there really was not a jury anywhere in Canada that wouldn't convict him. So if Richard wanted any chance of a lighter sentence, he had to come clean right now. But Richard didn't seem to care at all about Frechette's threats. He just kind of laid there, glaring at the floor and refusing to say a word. A few days later, Frechette was back at the Kapuskasing police station walking a constable through a script that he had written out. Now, Frechette still didn't actually know for sure if Richard really was the killer, but assuming he was, Frechette didn't know why he did it. He still was sort of torn on the issue. Like, did Richard Boucher kill him for personal reasons? Or was Richard hired by somebody else? However, despite being torn between these two ideas, Frechette had sort of landed on a theory, and a way to test it too. His plan was actually really simple. The constable that he was talking to right now was going to call the person Frechette suspected, and the constable was going to try to trick them into incriminating themselves. Now, Frechette couldn't do this himself, because the suspect would definitely recognize his voice, and so this wouldn't work that way. So once the constable was all prepped, Frechette picked up the phone, dialed the number, and then handed the phone to the constable. And when the suspect answered, the constable just launched into the script that Frechette had given them. He told the suspect he was a concerned friend, but he couldn't share his name. he had to be anonymous. And he said he was only calling for one reason. He knew what the suspect had done. What he wanted was just to hear exactly what the suspect had told the police. That was it, just to help them. The line went quiet for a second, and everybody just kind of held their breath as they waited to see what happened. But finally, the suspect spoke, and they said they hadn't told the police anything, and that they had enough money to make sure nobody else did either. And when Frechette heard that comment about having enough money here, he knew his theory had been right, because there was a mastermind, somebody behind Wilfred's murder, and they had just given themselves away. Based on witness testimony and recorded evidence, this is what police believe happened to Wilfred Gaudreau. On the afternoon of September 18th, 1987, so this is 4 months before Wilfred was killed, the mastermind behind Wilfred's murder, the eventual mastermind, sat in a diner in Timmins waiting for someone to arrive. They knew that meeting with this person was going to be a very big risk, but they were tired of feeling angry and they wanted Wilfred to pay. Eventually, the mastermind saw a man in his 30s enter the restaurant. And after they made eye contact, this man walked over and slid into the booth across from the mastermind. And then over lunch, the two of them talked through all the details of the mastermind's plan. 4 months later, on the morning of January 12th, 1988, basically in the middle of the night, the mastermind was laying awake in bed, literally shaking with nervous anticipation. Their heart was racing because this was it. Tonight was the night their plan was going to be carried out, which meant they were finally going to get the money they deserved out of Wilfred. And so the mastermind, as they were laying there, eventually noticed what time it was and knew at any moment it was about to start. And sure enough, just then they heard the sound of somebody walking in through the door that led into their house. Calm as can be, the mastermind simply climbed out of bed, walked into a bedroom closet, and closed the door. And that's because the mastermind was Wilfred's own girlfriend, Agathe Brichot. She'd gotten fed up with how cheap Wilfred was, and she wanted his money all to herself. And in fact, she'd already started taking it before he was dead. For months before the murder, she had been the one moving money from Wilfred's account to her own, without him ever noticing. Just sort of ironic for a guy that was so focused on protecting his money. Detective Frechette had honed in on Agathe when he learned about the missing money and realized that Agathe would have had access to Wilfred's bank accounts. Agathe had hired Richard to be her hitman, and she had been introduced to him by her niece, who happened to own one of the bars that Richard provided exotic dancers to. And Agathe actually paid Richard the money from Wilfred's own savings. So Wilfred basically paid for his own murder. Agathe Brichot and Richard Boucher were both charged with first-degree murder. However, Richard would take his own life before the trial. As for Agathe, she was convicted and she spent 20 years in prison before being released on parole in 2009. On July 23, 1980, 31-year-old Helen Hagnes stood with her husband Giannis outside their apartment building on New York's Upper West Side. Helen kissed Giannis and told him she would see him later, and then she turned and began walking to work. It was early evening, and Helen could already tell it was going to be another hot New York summer night. It was about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was humid. As Helen walked, she could already feel herself starting to sweat, and she just hoped she would still look okay when she got to work. She was dressed casually in a t-shirt and jeans, but her platinum blonde hair and makeup were perfectly styled, like she was going to a formal event. And in her hand, Helen carried an oblong case that held her most prized possession in the whole world, her violin. Helen had grown up as a musical prodigy, becoming an award-winning pianist at the age of 4 and a skilled violin player at the age of 8. Now, Helen was a highly accomplished violinist, and she had performed with symphonies and opera and ballet companies all over Europe and North America. Helen made her way through the city and eventually turned onto a street about 10 blocks from her house. Up ahead, she saw the Metropolitan Opera House, or the Met as it's known, and her face lit up. Helen had dreamed about playing violin at the Met ever since she was a little girl,
and she still couldn't believe that she was getting paid to come to this beautiful opera house to work alongside some of the most talented artists in the world. She turned onto a side street that led around the Met, and she entered through the backstage door. She smiled at a few Met employees and stagehands who were rushing back and forth getting ready for the night's ballet performance. Then Helen walked down a long, brightly lit hallway and went into the dressing room that was reserved for the women in the orchestra. Some of the other musicians had already arrived, and they all talked and laughed while they got dressed. Helen opened her locker and changed out of her street clothes into a black shirt, black pants, and black shoes. She took a blue flower from her locker and fastened it to her hair with a bobby pin. Then, a little before 8 p.m., about an hour after she had arrived, Helen took her place in the orchestra pit with the rest of the musicians. The roar of the applause flooded the theater, the house lights dimmed, the curtain rose, and the orchestra conductor turned to the musicians and waved his hand. Helen felt butterflies in her stomach. Even after all these years of playing, she still got nervous and excited. She raised her violin to her shoulder, placed her bow on the strings, waited for her cue, and started to play. About 40 minutes later, Helen heard the audience applauding once again. She had lost herself in the music like she always did, and so the first act of the ballet had sort of flown by in a blur. The curtain closed and the lights came up. It was the first of 2 intermissions. Helen placed her prized violin on her chair in the orchestra pit and headed backstage. She wasn't playing for the next section of the performance, and so she had an extended break. Helen walked right to the backstage elevator. She wanted to meet with the lead male dancer in the ballet, a famous Russian named Valery Panov. The elevator doors opened, and Helen stepped inside and stood between a man and a young ballerina. Helen told the ballerina she was going to see Panov, but she couldn't remember where his dressing room was. The ballerina said she didn't know either. Panov was a huge star, and he had his own dressing room that was separate from the rest of the dancers. Then the man chimed in and said Panov was on the 3rd floor. Helen thanked him, hit the button for the 3rd floor, and the elevator doors closed. The young ballerina stepped off the elevator at her dressing room floor. Then Helen rode up another floor, got off the elevator, and walked down a long hallway in search of Panov's dressing room. At 11:30 p.m., almost 3 hours after Helen got off that elevator, her husband Janis sat outside the Met in his van. Janis often picked his wife up to drive her home because walking at night in New York City in 1980 could be dangerous. Janis watched the dancers, musicians, and employees filing out of the Met, but he didn't see Helen. So he figured maybe she was still talking to one of her friends in the dressing room. But when it got to be midnight and Helen still had not come outside, Janis thought maybe she was getting a ride home with someone else and she had just forgotten to let him know. So he hopped out of his van, went to the nearest payphone, and called home. But there was no answer. So Janis figured there just must have been some miscommunication between him and his wife, and he headed home. A few minutes later, Janis walked into his and Helen's apartment, and it was empty. Janis thought it was a bit strange Helen wasn't home yet, even if she did get a ride home with someone else. But he figured maybe they had grabbed a drink before heading this way. Then he heard a knock at the door. This had to be Helen, and she must have forgotten her key or something. Janis went to the front door and opened it up, and suddenly he started to get worried. Because a nervous-looking man stood at the door with Helen's violin case in his hands. He said that he and some of the other musicians who played with Helen were really freaked out because Helen had left the orchestra pit during the first intermission and she never came back. He said a group of people had called the apartment and searched for Helen after the show, but they couldn't find her anywhere. Janis took Helen's violin case and he closed his eyes like he was fighting back tears. He knew his wife would never just leave her violin behind somewhere, not even at the Met. In a flat, quiet voice, Janis thanked the man for coming by. Then he closed the door, put down Helen's violin case, and went to the phone and called the police. In the early morning of July 24th, several hours after Janis called the police, Detective Jerry Giorgio of the NYPD walked into the lobby of the Met. The 2 officers who had arrived first greeted him and showed him the photo they had of Helen Hagnes. Detective Giorgio looked at the photo and heard the lobby doors open behind him. He turned and saw a frantic-looking young woman running in. Giorgio held up his hand to try to get her to slow down and asked if she was okay. She introduced herself and said she was a ballerina in the performance. She had heard about Helen going missing from one of her friends, and she thought she might be able to help, because she was pretty sure she was one of the last people who had seen Helen. The ballerina said that she and Helen happened to be on the backstage elevator together during the first intermission, and Helen had mentioned she was on her way to visit with Panov. Detective Giorgio asked who Panov was. The ballerina smiled and said Valery Panov was one of the most famous male ballet dancers in the whole world. Giorgio thanked her and said her information was a huge help. He got the ballerina's information and told her he would contact her if he needed anything else. As the ballerina walked away, Giorgio handed the photo of Helen back to the two officers and told them to wait there in case anyone else showed up. Then he walked further into the grand lobby of the Met, and the design of the place was like nothing he had ever seen. The huge staircases leading to the higher floors almost looked like they led to nowhere and just disappeared into the darkness. Giorgio had just started to search the lobby when a security guard walked in and introduced himself. His boss had told him to come down and help the police if they needed it. Giorgio was relieved. He said he didn't want to waste any time. He needed a full tour of the opera house. But at this, the security guard busted out laughing. He said that would be impossible. The building was massive, with 6 stories above ground and 3 basements below. And there were so many hallways and hidden rooms that navigating the Met was like walking through a maze. Giorgio said they would get as many cops as they needed to comb through the whole place, but in the meantime, he at least wanted a tour of the backstage area where Helen would have gone during intermission. So the security guard led Giorgio into the theater, up onto the stage, and into the wings. Giorgio looked around the expansive backstage area, and he saw giant set pieces, black curtains hanging everywhere, multiple exits, and an elevator. Then he walked down a stairwell and found himself in a vast, dimly lit basement that made him feel like he was in a horror movie. Giorgio saw cases for double bass instruments that were bigger than him leaned up against the wall. And scattered throughout the basement, he saw old set pieces from past performances and large wooden crates filled with costumes and props. Giorgio started to feel overwhelmed. He thought if the worst had happened, if Helen was dead, her body could be in a crate or an instrument case or in one of the countless dark corners, hiding just out of view. At around 8 a.m., after hours of exploring the depths of the Met, Detective Giorgio went back to the lobby and checked in with the other 2 officers who were still there. He was about to find a phone to call the police station to get more help when a maintenance worker ran inside, and this guy looked like he'd just seen a ghost. Giorgio asked him what was wrong, and the worker said he'd just gone up to the roof of the building to turn on one of the ventilation fans, and while he was up there, he found a pair of women's black shoes, like the ones he'd seen the women in the orchestra wear. Detective Giorgio's heart sank. Helen had disappeared in the middle of a performance, and now her shoes might have been found on the roof. And Giorgio's first thought was that Helen went up there, jumped off the building, taking her own life. Giorgio and the other officers followed the maintenance worker to a service elevator, and they traveled up to the roof in complete silence. The elevator stopped, the doors opened, and Giorgio had to squint as the daylight hit his eyes. The maintenance worker stepped out of the elevator and showed the police the pair of black shoes. Then Giorgio walked to the edge of the building and looked down, but there was nothing on the ground that looked out of the ordinary. So the officers spread out and searched the roof for any additional clues. And within a few minutes, Detective Giorgio heard one of them shout, "Oh my God!" Giorgio whipped around and saw an officer standing by this enormous metal fan, looking through the wide space between 2 of the blades down into the ventilation shaft. Giorgio joined him and leaned over to look into the shaft as well, and he thought he saw something about 30 feet below, but it was a little dark down there, and he couldn't tell what it was. It took a few seconds for Giorgio's eyes to adjust, but slowly, everything came into focus. There at the bottom, he saw the nude, bloody body of a woman. Shortly after, Detective Giorgio looked down the ventilation shaft and saw the woman's body. An NYPD homicide detective named Mike Struck finished his morning run in Central Park and called into the station to check in for the day. Dispatch told him not to even bother coming into the office. Instead, they said, go straight to the Metropolitan Opera House. Struck rushed home, got cleaned up and changed, and then raced down to the Met. The place was now buzzing with employees and police. and amid the crowd, Detective Strzok was happy to see Detective Giorgio. The two men enjoyed working together, and they made a good team. Giorgio was calm and almost fatherly, while Strzok was blunt and always seemed like he was moving 100 miles an hour. Giorgio filled Strzok in on everything police had found that morning. They had found Helen Hagnus's body in a large maintenance tunnel on the 3rd floor. It looked like she had fallen to her death through the ventilation shaft from the roof, but Giorgio was sure someone had pushed her, because her hands and feet had been bound with rope and there was a gag stuffed in her mouth. Giorgio thought the attack could have been sexual, but he had no idea if it was random or if somebody had targeted Helen. Then Strzok went to go take Polaroids of Helen's body, and he worked with crime scene technicians as they searched for clues. In addition to a pink bra, they found a pair of black pants, a black shirt, and a blue flower, all near the body. Later that day, several hours after the discovery of Helen's body, the NYPD had set up a fully operational command post inside the offices of the Opera House, and teams of detectives, uniformed police, and forensics technicians scoured the building for more evidence. Not long after the command center got set up, Detective Strzok left his and Giorgio's makeshift office, walked into the office of one of the Met's operations managers, and asked how many employees the Met had. But when the manager answered more than 800, all Strzok could do was laugh. That was an impossible number of people to interview. Still, he asked the manager for a list of all of those employees, as well as a separate list of the people who were actually working or performing at the Opera House when Helen had disappeared from the orchestra pit. When Strzok returned to his office, he found a crime scene technician waiting for him. The tech told Strzok they were able to lift a pristine palm print off the outside of that ventilation shaft on the roof. In fact, the print was so good, the tech worried that some careless police officer or other investigator had touched the ventilation shaft that morning and made the print. Strzok thanked the tech for the update and asked him to report back as soon as he knew anything, even if it was just to say that a cop had messed up and left that print. Then Strzok sat down at what was now his desk, he grabbed his phone, and called Helen's husband, Janis, and told him he needed to come in to the Met. Detectives Strzok and Giorgio sat in their office, reviewing their notes while they waited for their first suspect. Forensics officers and the medical examiner had not found any indication of sexual assault, which made them think it was possible that Helen's murder was actually just staged to look like a sexual assault. And they thought maybe Janis had met with Helen at some point during the intermission. Then they fought, and he took her up to the roof of the building, where he tied her up and killed her. As the two detectives theorized and talked through the case, the door opened and an officer led Janis in. Janis actually stumbled into the room and then collapsed into a chair across from the two detectives. Strzok and Giorgio could tell Janis was drunk just from the smell. And even if they couldn't tell from the smell, the open bottle of Jack Daniels in his hand made it pretty clear. This was a new one for both detectives. They had never seen someone show up to a police interview with a bottle of whiskey. But regardless, the detectives jumped right into the questions. They asked Janis about his and his wife's relationship. Janis was slurring his words, but he did manage to tell them that he loved his wife, and he had gone to the Met to pick her up and drive her home, but she had never showed up. Strzok and Giorgio listened, but they knew that almost nothing Janis said in his current state would ever hold up in court. I mean, the guy was drunk. So they told him they would have an officer drive him home, and after he'd gotten some rest, they would follow up with him if they needed to. Later that afternoon, Strzok and Giorgio were sitting in the theater when the famous Russian dancer Panov and his interpreter walked in. Panov, according to that ballerina that Giorgio had met that morning, may have been the last person who'd seen Helen alive. Panov took a seat near the detectives and asked how he could help. Then, through his interpreter, he said he did know a musician had gone missing at the Met, but he didn't know anything more than that. Giorgio handed Panov a picture of Helen and said she was the missing musician, and the last time anyone had seen her, she was on her way to meet Panov. Panov looked down at the picture and then said something in Russian. The interpreter then told the detectives that Panov did not know this woman, and she never came to visit him that night, and he had no idea she was even planning to. Then Panov spoke for himself. He explained in broken English that at least 50 people came to visit him every night. It was nothing unusual for audience members or other artists to flood his dressing room. And he tried to meet as many people as he could and be as gracious as he could because he knew that a lot of people had helped him become a ballet star. Struck asked him where he was at the time Helen disappeared during the first intermission. Panov said he had rushed to his dressing room to get changed and then went into the audience. He wasn't in the second part of the ballet, but his wife was, and he loved watching her dance. The detectives knew it would be easy to confirm this if it was true. Audience members and the crew would definitely have noticed one of the most famous dancers in the world walking amongst the crowd. So the detectives told both men they could go. Panov said he was sorry about what had happened to the musician, and then he and his interpreter headed backstage. It was late in the day at this point, and everyone working at the Met was getting ready for that evening's performance. So Giorgio and Struck decided to head home and regroup in the morning. The next day, the detectives walked into the Met lobby and greeted the young ballerina who had flagged down Giorgio the day before to say she had ridden on the backstage elevator with Helen. As far as the detectives knew, she may have been the last person to see Helen alive, other than the killer. So they had asked her to come back to see if maybe she could give them a clearer picture of Helen's movements that night. The detectives led the ballerina to their office, and she sat down across from them. She said she was glad they called her because she had remembered something. When she was in the elevator with Helen, there was a man that was there with them. He had told Helen that Panov's dressing room was on the third floor, and this man was still with Helen when the ballerina got off the elevator. Giorgio and Struck leaned forward. This was huge. It meant that that man on the elevator was either the last witness to see Helen alive, or he was the killer. Struck asked the ballerina if she could describe what this man in the elevator looked like. The ballerina squinted her eyes like she was trying to remember, but she shook her head and apologized. She knew he was a man, but that was about it. Detective Giorgio leaned over to Struck and whispered something in his ear, and Struck nodded in agreement. Then Giorgio turned to the ballerina and said he knew this was going to sound strange, but sometimes the police used a hypnotist to help witnesses remember things in more detail. So Giorgio wanted to know if the ballerina would agree to be hypnotized, and the ballerina said yes. So that afternoon, a hypnotist dimmed the lights in the office and then took a seat across from the ballerina. At the same time, Giorgio and Struck lingered in the corner, and an NYPD sketch artist sat a few feet away, holding his pencil and a sketchbook. The hypnotist told the ballerina to close her eyes and listen only to his voice. And slowly, the hypnotist used his soothing voice and his words to draw the ballerina deeper and deeper into a state of relaxation, until finally she was in a trance. Once she was, the hypnotist asked the ballerina to turn back the clock in her mind to the moment that Helen had stepped on the elevator with her. He asked the ballerina to look closely at the elevator and the man who was there, and to describe him as best as she could. The ballerina concentrated, and she began to speak, describing this man. She said he looked like he was between 20 and 25 years old. He was slightly overweight, had a large nose, brown hair, and bright red lips. And as the ballerina gave these details, the sketch artist began to draw. A few minutes later, the hypnotist gently brought the ballerina out of her trance and turned the lights back on. Police quickly made copies of the sketch and circulated it among the Met's employees. And while they were hopeful, there was the reality that a lot of people could fit the description of a young, slightly overweight guy with brown hair. But later that day, a Met employee walked into the detective's office and told them there was someone they needed to talk to right away. It was a stagehand named Vincent Donahue. Struck asked if Vincent fit the description of the man the sketch artist had drawn. The employee said he did, at least a few days ago, but on the night following Helen's murder, Vincent had showed up to work and he had completely shaved off his brown hair and he had a large scratch on his face. That afternoon, Vincent Donahue took a seat inside the detective's office, and he looked annoyed. He said he needed this to be fast because he had a lot of work to do before the performance that night. Giorgio smiled and said he understood, but first he said he had to ask where did that nasty scratch on his face come from. Vincent said he and his girlfriend had gotten into a pretty bad fight a couple of nights ago, and his girlfriend used her fingernails when she got angry. Detective Struck quickly jumped in and asked why Vincent had shaved his head. Vincent laughed and said during the argument with his girlfriend where she scratched him, she had said the only good thing about him was his hair. So after she had stormed out of the room, he had shaved his hair off just out of spite. Strzok had a look on his face like this seemed totally ridiculous, and Vincent could tell. So Vincent quickly said, "Really, this is the truth." Then he told the detectives he didn't have anything to do with that musician getting killed. And he said instead of wasting time talking to him, they needed to talk to a guy named Craig Crimmins. Vincent said Craig was also a stagehand, and he had missed a major cue to move scenery during the second act of the performance on the night Helen died. He had just left his backstage post and disappeared. Now, Strzok thought Vincent could still be lying. However, the idea that a stagehand went missing around the same time that Helen went missing was suspicious. So Strzok told Vincent he could leave and go back to work, but they might need him again. And as soon as Vincent left the office, Strzok and Giorgio sent an officer to track down the stagehand, Craig Crimmins. When Craig stepped into Strzok and Giorgio's office, he looked exhausted. Giorgio asked Craig to take a seat, and then once he handed him a photo of Helen and asked Craig if he knew her. Craig glanced at the picture and said he only recognized her from what he had seen in the news. He'd never met her or talked to her. She was a musician, and he didn't really interact with the musicians. Strzok just stared at Craig while he spoke. He was young and had brown hair, just like the ballerina's description. So Strzok asked if Craig had ridden the backstage elevator at all on the night Helen died. But Craig just shook his head. He said he'd been at his spot backstage the whole performance. Strzok leaned across the desk and said if that was true, then why had his colleagues claimed that Craig had been absent from backstage during an important cue that night, specifically during the second act? Craig's face flushed and he stared down at the floor. He said he did miss a cue that night, but he didn't leave backstage. He was embarrassed to admit it to the cops, but he had shown up to work that night drunk and fallen asleep at his post. He told the detectives that another stagehand who worked right beside him backstage had seen him and could back him up that he was telling the truth. Strzok and Giorgio questioned Craig a bit longer, and then they let him go. They quickly found the other stagehand Craig had mentioned, and this guy said Craig was telling the truth. He had passed out backstage and basically slept through part of the performance. With Craig's alibi checking out, the detectives still believed they had viable suspects among the other people they had talked to. But they still had hundreds more people to interview, and they still hadn't heard anything about the one major piece of forensic evidence that had been found, the fresh palm print that had been pulled from the ventilation shaft on the roof. So the detectives felt like if they didn't quickly find some new evidence, they were going to be stuck with an overwhelmingly massive suspect pool. 6 days after Helen's murder, on July 29, 1980, her memorial service was held at a New York City church. The church was filled with friends, family, and countless people from the Met. One of Helen's violinist friends performed at the service in her honor. In the 2 weeks following Helen's funeral, Detectives Strzok and Giorgio continued their work at the Met, but the Opera House had grown oddly quiet. The ballet had finished its run of performances, and the next show had not opened yet. So the detectives found themselves wandering through the nearly empty, huge building, trying to find anything that they might have missed. But nothing came of those additional searches, and even after weeks of combing through the place, they still felt like there were corners of the Met that remained hidden. But just at the point when the detectives worried their case was about to go cold, Strzok got a call from an excited forensics technician. The tech said he could not believe it, but that nearly perfect palm print found on the ventilation shaft did not belong to a careless police officer or investigator like the forensics team had originally suspected. And it was a relatively fresh print, so it could belong to the killer. When Detective Strzok hung up, he told Giorgio what he just learned, and Giorgio got excited. This palm print was not a smoking gun just yet, but it definitely could be. It was very difficult to access the roof of the Met, so the detectives believed the print had to belong to somebody who worked or performed there, or someone who came by fairly often to visit a family member who worked there. Over the next several days, Opera House employees met with the police in groups of 2s and 3s, and they allowed officers to take their palm prints. And only one of them seemed really nervous about it when asked to give their print. And this was somebody Strzok and Giorgio had already spoken to. This person broke out into a sweat and said that they were uncomfortable with this whole situation. But Detective Giorgio smiled softly, and in his best fatherly voice, he said providing a print was the best way for police to cross them off the list and allow them to put all this behind them. So ultimately, this person agreed and gave their palm print. And when testing on that print came back, Detectives Giorgio and Struck saw that it was a perfect match to the one found on the roof. And they believed they had found Helen's killer. Based on the palm print, evidence from the scene, and interviews conducted during the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Helen Hagnes on the night of July 23, 1980. The killer saw Helen walking down a hallway on the third floor during the first intermission of the ballet, and they quickly walked down the hall and grabbed her arm. Helen turned around and didn't understand what was happening, but the killer just pulled out a hammer and pushed her into a stairwell. The killer dragged Helen down all the stairs to one of the sub-basements, and then once there, he demanded she take off her clothes. And Helen did. The killer attempted to rape Helen, but they couldn't. And so out of frustration, they demanded Helen put her clothes back on, and then they grabbed her by the arm, and still with the hammer in hand, they led her all the way upstairs to the roof. Once on the roof, the killer once again made Helen get undressed. Except this time, the killer also bound her wrists and her ankles, and they also gagged her. But Helen fought back, and at some point during the struggle, the killer knew they were running out of time. And so out of frustration and panic and anger and embarrassment, they scooped up Helen and they walked over to the air conditioning vent and they placed her on the ledge. And then, as Helen desperately tried to push past them and get back on the roof, the killer just raised up their leg, placed their foot on her side, and they pushed her into the vent. Helen would fall 6 stories to her death. And after she was dead, the killer reached down, scooped up her clothes, and threw them into the vent after her. After that, the killer ran to the door, believing they had disposed of all the evidence. Except they hadn't. They had accidentally left Helen's shoes up on the roof. The killer flew down the stairs all the way to the theater and ran backstage. However, by the time they got there, they were out of time. The intermission was over and the ballet had started again, meaning the killer had missed a very important cue. Craig Crimmins, the stagehand who claimed to have shown up drunk and fallen asleep backstage, killed Helen Hagnes. On the night of the murder, Craig was in fact the man on the elevator with Helen and the young ballerina. And when Helen asked about where Panov's dressing room was, Craig had chimed in and said it was on the 3rd floor. But that was a lie. He was simply trying to trap her. And so when Helen got off the elevator on the 3rd floor, Craig followed her down the hallway, grabbed her, and brought her to the basement, intending to rape her. However, he could not perform sexually, and so in his rage and humiliation, he dragged her up to the roof where he would kill her. Craig did resemble the sketch from the ballerina's hypnosis session. However, it was Craig's palm print on the air conditioning vent that made detectives turn their focus on him. And soon after the detectives discovered Craig's print matched the one on the ventilation shaft, they learned that the other stagehand who said he saw Craig sleeping backstage was lying for his coworker. But he thought Craig had asked him to lie for him just to cover up the fact that he had left backstage and missed an important cue. Craig Crimmins was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 20 years to life. He went on to serve 40 years in prison and was paroled in August of 2021.
On the evening of December 24, 2001, a 48-year-old businessman named Kevin Butler was in his kitchen inside of his home in Dallas, Texas, preparing food. The following day, he was going to bring this food to a Christmas party at his friend's house. And as Kevin was preparing this food, he heard his friend Larry, who spent a lot of time at his house, call to him from down the hall. Now, Kevin didn't really hear what Larry wanted, but he could tell from the tone of his voice that, he wanted him to come over there right now. And so Kevin said, okay, I'll be there in a second. But then, after washing off his hands and beginning to walk down the hall to go see Larry, Kevin heard another sound that stopped him in his tracks. He heard the sound of 2 men's voices coming from outside of his house. The men sounded drunk, and they sounded like they were literally in his front yard. And also, Kevin thought he recognized the voices. And so instinctively, Kevin flew over to the door and whipped it open, and sure enough, it was Johnny Serna, one of Kevin's former employees, and Daniel Torres, who was Johnny's half-brother. These were the 2 men he thought he heard outside, and here they are. And even though Kevin was expecting to see them when he opened the door, it was like seeing them in real life was just totally incendiary. Kevin was immediately so mad. For several months, Kevin and Johnny had been in this very public feud over money. And in fact, Johnny at one point had even tried to steal from Kevin by forging a check. And so now Kevin looked right at Johnny and Daniel and goes, "Oh, what are you guys here to steal from me again?" And in response, Johnny didn't say anything. He just charged forward and punched Kevin square in the face. Kevin was so stunned that he practically fell over, and then before he could do anything, Johnny and Daniel had pummeled him to the ground and were kicking and punching him, and then they dragged him further into his house and slammed the door behind him. Kevin continued to try to get away, but he just couldn't. One of the brothers was holding him down, and then before long, one of the others had gone off and come back with electrical cord, and they tied him up. And then once Kevin literally was fully bound and couldn't go anywhere, the brothers went into the kitchen, got knives, came back, and they began stabbing Kevin over and over and over again. And as all this commotion was happening out in the living room, Kevin's friend Larry, who was right down the hall, heard the whole thing. He heard the sound of, the two drunk guys coming in. He heard the sound of Kevin clearly being attacked. And at first, Larry was terrified and didn't know what to do. But as he heard the sound of Kevin screaming out for help, Larry jumped into action, and he flew down the hallway and he charged out there, and he saw Daniel still on top of Kevin stabbing him, and Larry just went right after Daniel. Now, Larry was unarmed and really didn't stand much of a chance to begin with, but he did whatever he could to try to get Daniel off. He began biting and scratching him and doing whatever he could, but it wasn't enough. And eventually, Daniel overpowered Larry, and then before long, Johnny and Daniel were not just stabbing Kevin, but were also stabbing Larry. And so in the end, both Kevin and Larry, the two friends, were stabbed to death. And then after they were dead, Johnny and Daniel fled the scene. But what the two half-brothers didn't know was that even though they had just killed Larry, Larry had actually just made sure those two brothers would get caught. Because when Larry tried to fight Daniel off, he had literally bit Daniel and gotten Daniel's blood on his mouth. And ultimately, when the police showed up, they took the blood from Larry's mouth, and that was DNA evidence, and it led them right to Daniel. And so Daniel and Johnny were soon arrested and charged with murder. However, they were only charged with one murder. And that's because during the attack, when Larry flew down the hall to try to protect Kevin, well, he literally flew. Because Larry was not a person. Larry was Kevin's pet cockatoo, and he was named after Larry Bird. Kevin had adopted Larry 2 years earlier, and the two had become like best friends. And so when Larry heard his best friend Kevin being attacked, he flew in to try to help, and he wound up clawing and pecking at Daniel's head, ultimately getting Daniel's blood on his beak, which led to their arrest. Daniel Torres and Johnny Cerna were both ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. At 6:30 p.m. on July 29, 2023, a 15-year-old girl named Talia Davila Diaz stood right outside her back door of her house, staring out at the thick, dense, shadowy rainforest that was her backyard. Talia lived in a tiny, isolated village in Peru that was literally in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. So as she was looking out, she would have seen these huge tropical trees and heard the sound of howler monkeys and exotic birds and animals moving all about, and the air would have been really thick and humid. But she wasn't thinking about any of that. Instead, she was focused on this grapefruit tree that was only a few yards away from her house. She wanted to go get a grapefruit and bring it inside and make juice for her family. However, Talia was scared. And she was scared for two reasons. The first reason was this was the Amazon, an inherently dangerous place, especially at night. There were loads of predators out there, like snakes and jaguars. But the other reason she was scared was that she was worried there could actually be something worse out in the rainforest, worse than any predators she was used to. And that was because over the last couple of weeks, people in Talia's village had been claiming they were seeing these shadowy figures lurking in the tree line with these bright green eyes that would occasionally seem like they were hunting the people of the village. Like anytime they went out, it was like these figures were kind of lurking off in the distance, but nobody knew what they were. The rumor around the village was that these shadowy figures were actually pelikaras, which translates literally to face peelers. People in Talia's village believed that pelikaras were foreigners who would kidnap locals and cut their throats and peel the skin of their face off and then sell their body fat on the black market. And the locals were so freaked out that pelikaras could be around that they began performing nightly patrols to keep the villagers safe. So Talia, again, was very scared to even leave her house at this point. But she was also trying to be reasonable. She'd gone out and gotten a grapefruit many times in the past. This was not some new behavior. So she's looking out and she sees the grapefruit tree and she knows there's a nightly patrol out right now, and I only have to go a few yards and get the fruit and get right back in the house. Like, how big of a deal could this possibly be? And so after taking one more look around and not seeing anybody or hearing anything that was out of place, she took a breath and then rushed out to the tree. She grabbed a grapefruit, and as she was turning around, she froze, because her worst nightmare had just been realized. Now, standing between her and her back door were these two hulking dark figures. And one of them was like so tall, it was practically the size of a tree. And they both had these piercing, glowing green eyes. And they were looking right at Talia. And Talia was so instantaneously petrified that all she could do was just stand there and stare back into their green eyes. And as she did, she began to notice that their faces were grotesquely elongated, almost like they had masks on. And then before Talia could do anything, the really tall one began sort of gliding towards her. Not stepping towards her, but literally almost hovering off the ground towards Talia. And then suddenly, Talia was being grabbed and thrown to the ground. And the instant Talia hit the ground, these two figures descended on her and pinned her there. And then one of them reached down and pressed their hand over her mouth and her nose, and she couldn't breathe. And then she sees the other one is holding what looked like a box cutter or a knife, and they put it right up to her neck. And suddenly it's like Talia understands these are Pelikaras. They're gonna slit her throat. They're gonna kill her. And so she has this sudden burst of energy and she manages to push them off of her. And when she did, their hand came off her mouth and she screamed out for help. And she heard somewhere in the village voices yelling back to her, and then she heard footsteps, and she knew it was the night patrol coming to save her. And so at this point, the figures released Talia, and she scrambled to her feet and immediately ran towards her house right as the night patrol came bounding into her yard, and one of the men had a gun, and he raised it and began shooting in the direction of the figures. And Talia, she's totally panicked, and she turns around and she looks at her attackers, and she's expecting them to, be fleeing into the rainforest. But instead, these dark figures, they were like levitating in the sky, and they were looking down at Talia and the night patrol with their glowing green eyes as they literally began to levitate into the sky. And the whole time, the night patrol is firing repeatedly at these things, and they just drifted off into the night and disappeared. Talia ultimately would not suffer any physical injuries from this encounter, but mentally, she was a wreck. And frankly, so was the rest of the people in her village, especially those who were on the night patrol and with Talia witnessed these figures with green eyes flying away into the sky. I mean, the fear in this village following this encounter was through the roof. And in fact, ultimately, the Peruvian government would get involved after this encounter, and they would investigate to try to figure out, what happened to Talia. And they would ultimately conclude that there was an illegal mining operation happening somewhere in the rainforest, and some of these miners, in an effort to scare people away from coming anywhere near their operation, they got their hands on jetpacks, wore armor and masks, and then went into villages like Talia's and basically pretended to be aliens and then did, fly off on their jetpacks. That is the official story as of right now. However, people like Talia and the other people in her village and many other people who live in the Amazon rainforest who have come in contact with these figures with green eyes, they say those are no miners. Those are either Pelikaras or they are creatures from another world. On the afternoon of May 21st, 1974, a 39-year-old man named Pilar Gomez walked through a forest in Argentina. In his hand was a machete and an axe. And as he walked, he used the machete to clear brush, and then eventually he reached this huge tree, and he put the machete down, gripped his axe, and got ready to chop it down. However, before Pilar took his first swing, he looked up and he noticed pretty high up on this tree were these very deep claw marks right into the bark of the tree. Now, at first he thought, oh, that's gotta be, a bear's claw marks. But the more he looked at it, the more he realized that would have been an enormous bear to leave marks like those. I mean, these are deep and wide claw marks. Now, Pilar was a professional lumberjack, and he actually lived in this section of forest. He owned this plot of the forest. His cabin was only a few yards away, and he was used to coming in contact with the wildlife, like bears. Now, his friends and family thought he was crazy for living out here. I mean, his neighbors were miles away, he didn't have a phone or a car, he lived totally alone. And so, in virtue of living in this isolated forest, Pilar routinely came across animals that lived out here, like bears. And it didn't really frighten him. He sort of understood that's part of living out here. But he knew his friends and family thought he was totally crazy for living out here. And not just because it was so isolated, not just because he didn't have a car or a phone and was totally alone basically 24/7, but because, according to local legend, this particular forest was effectively haunted. There were these apparent unnatural huge creatures that roamed this forest and would prey on people like Pilar. But Pilar didn't believe in any of that nonsense. He knew that, as he looked at these claw marks, this has to be a bear. This is not some huge unnatural creature that's completely made up. And so Pilar just went ahead and began cutting this tree down. And right as this tree smashed into the ground, making a thundering boom, at the exact same moment, basically right behind Pilar, he heard this horrible growling noise, like a huge animal was basically coming up right behind him. And so Pilar, he whipped around and looked, but there was nothing there. It was just a wide open forest. Everywhere he looked, it was just trees, nothing else. And so Pilar began to think to himself, did I even hear that? I mean, could I really have just been hearing the sound of the tree hitting the ground that somehow also sounded like a growl behind me? Like, am I, psyching myself out here? Am I creating stories in my head because I'm thinking about those claw marks? And he was like, you know what? It's all gonna be in my head. I didn't hear anything. I'm all alone out here. I'm safe. I'm good. And so Pilar just got back to work processing this tree. For the next couple of hours, he didn't see or hear anything strange. He just continued to chop this tree into smaller pieces, and then he would carry those pieces right over to his cabin, which again was not far away, and he stacked up this huge pile of lumber right beside the side of his cabin. And then finally, when the tree was all processed and Pilar was back in his cabin, he realized he was pretty hungry. At this point, it was getting dark outside and it was time for dinner. Typically, Pilar would eat his dinner outside. He enjoyed listening to the crickets and just feeling the warm night air, and tonight was no exception. So he grabbed some stew from the night before, he went outside, and outside he had this table that was right next to his cabin, and then just beyond the table, farther away from the cabin, was this wood stove. And so he got the wood stove going, and then he put his stew on the stove to warm up, and then he sat down at the table, and he just sat there, enjoying the night, waiting for his food to be done. And as Pilar just sat there relaxing, he suddenly realized that he couldn't hear any crickets. They had gone completely silent. And then as he looked around at the dark forest, he realized the forest was actually silent. I mean, there was no noise whatsoever. The only noise was his stove. And Pilar knew that the only time the forest got this way was if there was some big predator around. And so right away, Pilar thought back to the claw marks in the tree and, that growling sound that he wasn't sure if he heard or not. And he's thinking, maybe the bear is back. And so Pilar scanned the tree line, trying to see movement. But there was nothing. It was just deadly silent and just a dark forest in all directions. And so feeling really unsettled, Pilar decided he should just go back inside his cabin and eat in there where it was more safe. And so Pilar stood up and he walked towards his cabin and he was about to go inside when he remembered he had left the stove on with his stew on top warming up. And so he turned back around and he looked out at the dark forest and it's still totally silent. He can't see any movement. And as quick as he could, he walked past the table, out to the stove, he shut the vents in the stove, and he was about to grab the stew to go back inside with it, when something really powerful struck him in the back, knocking the wind out of him, and then before he could react, he looked down and he saw this massive furry arm with sharp claws reaching around him, pulling at his midsection. It was the bear. And so immediately Pilar began thrashing, trying to get away, and he managed to kind of stumble forward, and his machete was on the ground near the stove, and he fumbles down, he grabs the machete, and he wheels around to strike this bear to get rid of it. But the second he saw the bear, he realized it wasn't a bear, and instinctively he knew he just had to run. And so he turned and began sprinting towards that lumber pile he had cut up before right next to his cabin. And as he was scrambling up this pile, he could hear the sound of this thing running towards him. And then he felt another explosion on the side of his head. And even though he now has been wounded, probably gravely, it was like all adrenaline. And he kept going up the lumber pile and he clambered onto the roof of his cabin. Then he turned around, getting ready to fight as best as he could, whatever this thing was. But when he looked out, this thing was just gone. the forest was deadly silent again and there was nothing out there. And so as he's sitting there kind of looking around, waiting for this thing to pop back up again, he reached up and he felt the side of his head and his ear was missing. This thing had ripped his ear off when it hit him in the side of the head. Pilar would remain on the roof of his cabin all night, just constantly scanning, looking for this bear creature to return. But it didn't. The forest just remained totally silent and nothing happened all night. And then finally in the morning, when the sun began to come up, the forest kind of went back to normal. And at that point, Pilar, he's kind of delirious from blood loss and the impact to his head. And he knew he just had to get out of here and go get help. And so he climbed off the roof and then he ran about a mile to the nearest building, which was this woodworking shop. And when he got there, there were a couple of people there. And when they saw the state Pilar was in, they didn't need to be told that he needed to go to the hospital. They just instinctively put him in the car and drove him there. After Pilar was stabilized and his wound was treated and he was sort of in recovery at the hospital, the police showed up to interview him to see what happened. And Pilar would tell them the story about how, the day before he had seen those claw marks in the tree and then he had heard that loud growling sound behind him, or so he thought. And then that night, this bear had attacked him at his cabin, and he said at some point he'd broken away and grabbed the machete and he turned to defend himself and he got a good look at this bear. And it was at least 6 feet tall, it was covered in black hair, had sharp claws. It was every bit a bear, except its face. It wasn't a bear's face. It was a human face. Now, to this point, as Pilar was telling his story, one of the police officers was taking notes. Everything Pilar said, he was writing it down. But when Pilar began talking about the bear with the human face, the officer just stopped taking notes, and the officer said, that can't be true. There aren't any bears with human faces. But Pilar, he's like a rugged lumberjack who lives in the forest by himself. And he's telling these officers, I know how crazy this sounds. I know it's not realistic, but I'm telling you what I saw is this bear with a human face. That's what I saw. But the officer just 100% did not believe him. And ultimately, this went down as simply a bear attack, and that was it. The case was closed. However, despite what the police said, since the attack on Pilar, there have been at least 30 people who have come forward to say they either saw firsthand or were attacked by this bear-like creature with a human face in that forest in Argentina. Sightings are so common that locals even came up with a name for this creature. They call it the Ucumar. And to this day, nobody has any idea who or what it is. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese famously attacked Pearl Harbor, the US military base in Hawaii. But Pearl Harbor was not the only US base attacked by the Japanese that month. In fact, just hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese shifted gears and attacked US military personnel on Wake Island, which is a coral atoll in the northern Pacific Ocean. After 2 weeks of fighting, the Japanese had taken Wake Island from the Americans, and they sent the majority of American military personnel and American civilian contractors to prisoner of war camps in Asia. But they retained 98 of these POWs to stay on the island and fortify defenses. Over the next couple of years, the Americans would periodically bomb Wake Island, but there was never any concerted effort to take it back from the Japanese. However, that all changed on October 5th, 1943, when the Americans decided it was time to take it back. They launched a huge air raid on the island that was so violent, the Japanese admiral on Wake Island was convinced a full-scale invasion was imminent. And so in his paranoia, he ordered the 98 POWs they had retained on the island to be executed. And so they marched these 98 POWs to the edge of the sea, they blindfolded them, and then they gunned them down. But in the chaos of the air raid and the execution, one of the American POWs somehow managed to escape. After the Japanese had left the area, this POW snuck back down to the execution site, and he carved into the rock a memorial for all 98 of the POWs. So he was including himself in that number because I'm sure he knew he would eventually be recaptured. This was a small area and he was the only American there. And sure enough, this POW was recaptured that day and he was personally executed by the Japanese admiral. The identity of this POW has never been determined. After the war ended, the Japanese admiral that ordered these executions was tried for war crimes, found guilty, and put to death himself. The so-called 98 Rock can still be seen on Wake Island today. On January 25th, 1998, American tourists Tom and Eileen Lonergan boarded a boat in Queensland, Australia. The married couple was from Louisiana. Tom was 34 and Eileen was 28. They had spent the last 2 years in Fiji and Tuvalu serving in the Peace Corps. Australia was just a pit stop on their way back home. They both were avid scuba divers and they wanted a chance to dive on the world's largest coral reef system, the Great Barrier Reef. Once Tom, Eileen, and the other 24 tourists had boarded this boat, the captain did a head count, and then once he had everyone, he turned the boat around and headed out to sea. After traveling 25 miles, the captain stopped the boat and then told the group to put on their dive gear. So Tom, Eileen, and the others happily put on their fins and their masks and their tanks, and then when they were ready, they were inspected and then allowed to jump into the Coral Sea. Less than an hour later, the divers came back up to the surface and the captain began pulling them back into the boat. Once everyone was back on board the boat, the captain did another head count just to confirm he had everyone, and once he was sure he did, he turned the boat around and he headed back to shore. Except the captain miscounted and neither he nor anyone else noticed. Shortly after the boat had left the area, Tom and Eileen Lonergan came up from their dive and looked around and realized they had been abandoned. After the initial panic wore off, they probably told each other that don't worry, as soon as that boat gets back to shore, they will find inside the boat our wallets and passports and other personal items, and they'll know we aren't with them and they'll come out and get us. And so most likely the couple was fairly optimistic as they just treaded water waiting for someone to show up any minute. Except they didn't show up any minute. It took 48 hours before anybody showed up because that's how long it took before someone saw their wallets and passports and personal items were still inside that dive boat. And in those 48 hours, Tom and Eileen were exposed to intense summer heat, no fresh water, and sharks. When their personal effects were finally found, a huge search was launched for them, but there was no sign of them. A month later, a female wetsuit washed up on the shores of Australia, and it was the same size as Eileen's, and an expert analyzed it and said it had been floating in the water for about a month. So that lined up with when Tom and Eileen went missing. 5 months later, more diving equipment washed up on the shores of Australia. Among those items were life jackets with the Lonergan name stenciled on the back of them, as well as an air tank and a dive fin that belonged to Eileen. But the most disturbing thing that washed up on shore was the couple's diver's slate. A diver's slate is like a dry erase board that works underwater. On this slate was the Lonergan's final message. It said, "To anyone who can help us, we've been abandoned on Agincourt Reef. Please help us before we die. Please help." Above the message was a date. It was January 26th, 1998. So that would have been one day after they were abandoned at sea. So we know the couple was alive for at least 24 hours. But beyond that, no one knows what happened. Some say the pair staged their disappearance so they could start a new life somewhere, or so they could take their own lives. Others say they were devoured by sharks. Most experts believe they eventually became delirious from the dehydration, and that would have caused them to willingly take off their diving equipment, and without that equipment, they wouldn't have been buoyant, and so at some point they couldn't have continued treading water, and they would have drowned. But regardless of which theory is correct, Tom and Eileen have never been found. Bryce Gillies was born in 1989 in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. From a young age, Bryce's parents knew he loved the outdoors, and so they signed him up for the Boy Scouts. And as a scout, Bryce learned, amongst many things, how to survive in the wilderness. And he would routinely put this training to the test by leaving his house and heading off to the nearby Appalachian Trail and hiking around sometimes up to 20 miles in a single day. Bryce ultimately became an Eagle Scout, which is the highest rank anybody can obtain inside of the Boy Scouts, a rank that only about 8% of scouts will ever reach. After he graduated from high school in 2007, Bryce decided he wanted to go to school out west. And during a visit to Northern Arizona University, Bryce fell in love with their school because all around their campus were these unbelievable hiking trails that were totally unlike anything he saw growing up on the East Coast. Bryce decided this was his dream school, so he applied, and a couple weeks later, he got accepted. He was totally thrilled. During his first couple of years at NAU, Bryce took full advantage of these totally amazing hiking trails within a couple hours of the campus. He also spent some time overseas in West Africa, helping to build a medical clinic for people in need. During the summer break of 2009, so going into his third year at NAU, Bryce was still living out in Arizona in an apartment, and he still had a few weeks before classes started. And so he decided he would head off to the nearby Grand Canyon to do a little bit of hiking. He had recently read in an outdoor magazine about this lesser known but unbelievable trail that was just for experts in the canyon that he wanted to try. It was called the Deer Creek Thunder River Loop, and it brought hikers to this remote location where water gushed out of this huge limestone rock wall, transforming the desert landscape below into this unbelievable green oasis. The article said very strong hikers could complete this nearly 28-mile loop in about 3 days. Since Bryce considered himself a very strong hiker, he decided this was perfect for him. Bryce called his parents and let them know he was going to do this loop and that when he came back in a couple of days, he'd be making a trip to Virginia to visit with them. Then Bryce called some friends in the area to see if they wanted to come with him on this hike, but no one was available, so Bryce decided he would go on his own. So the next day, which was Saturday, July 18th, Bryce loaded up his car and he began driving these several hours to the parking lot that was nearest the trailhead. Bryce parked his car, he got his gear out of the trunk, and then he set off down the trail. Bryce had not obtained a backcountry permit for this hike. This was a requirement for anybody doing an overnight out in the canyon, which Bryce planned on doing. Bryce also didn't file his route with the park rangers. Had he told them where he was going, they would have tried to talk him out of it. The Deer Creek Thunder River Loop had no protection from the sun the entire time, and since it was July, he would be hit with the highest temperatures and the most direct sunlight. All this on top of the fact that even in the coolest times of the year, this trail is still an extremely difficult trail because of the terrain you have to navigate. In fact, when hikers did file their route with park rangers and they indicated they were going to be doing this expert loop, they would ask them to provide next of kin information in case they died during their hike. It's unclear if Bryce was just very confident in himself and his abilities, or if he was being reckless. From his car, Bryce hiked about 2 miles down some switchbacks into the canyon. Once he reached the bottom, he would have found himself in this wide open flat area called the Esplanade that kind of looked like the surface of the moon with all these potholes all over it. At this point in Bryce's hike, it would have been dark out, so he would have set up his tent somewhere on the rocks and camped out for the night. People that have done this, that have camped out on the Esplanade, have said it's unbelievably beautiful because most people experience the Grand Canyon from high up on one of the rims looking down into it. But the Esplanade is literally inside the canyon, so you have this unobstructed view in both directions, and apparently it's quite beautiful. The next morning, Bryce got up at sunrise, he packed up his campsite, and then he continued on his hike. The first challenge he would come up against that morning was navigating down what's called the Red Wall, which is a fairly steep and treacherous descent that for an experienced hiker, it would take about an hour to safely navigate. And then at the bottom of the Red Wall, you would enter into this area called the Surprise Valley. No one really knows why it's named that, but hikers who have been down in this valley, they think it's named after the surprise you feel when you get in there and you realize how much hotter it is. Typically, it's about 10 or 20 degrees hotter down inside of this bowl. After Bryce successfully navigated down the Red Wall, he entered into this totally miserable Surprise Valley, but he would have known he was only about a half-mile away from his target destination, the Deer Creek Thunder River, where he planned to jump in and cool off. So, eager to do that, Bryce took off, but made a critical mistake. He went the wrong way. While it's unclear exactly how this happened, experts believe his ears played a trick on him. Hikers are told as they're approaching this river in the middle of the desert, they should listen out for it, because when you get fairly close, you can hear the sound of rushing water. But hikers have to be careful because sometimes when the wind is blowing in a certain direction, that sound from the river will echo off the inside of this bowl and it will appear to come from the opposite direction. It's believed Bryce was following his map when he heard the sound of this river coming from a different direction, and so he abandoned the map and followed the sound. Bryce walked for quite a while in the wrong direction, all the way up a hill, and most likely the whole time he was hearing the sound of the water, and he probably thought, once I get over the top of this hill, I'll look down the other side and I will see the water. But when he crested the hill, he looked down and just saw a barren valley. Had he continued another quarter mile down into the valley and then up the other side, he could have turned around and he would have been able to spot an obvious landmark that would have brought him to the river. But most likely, Bryce was exhausted from the extreme heat and the sunlight and trekking all this way, and so he felt like it was probably too risky to keep going down into this valley because he had no idea where it went. So in keeping with his wilderness training he got as a Boy Scout, he dropped all of his heavy equipment off the side of the trail trail in an area he had marked so he could eventually come back and retrieve it. And then he took his water, food, and headlamp, turned around, and began backtracking. After a little while, Bryce decided to abandon the trail and actually veer off onto a dry creek bed. In the Boy Scouts, they're taught any dry creek bed will eventually connect to water. And so at this point, Bryce is probably running low on water and figures whether this leads him to the Deer Creek Thunder River or some other water body, he didn't care. He just needed water. So off he went on this dry creek bed, but after a while, he saw less and less vegetation. It was just this barren desert in all directions. After a little while longer, Bryce dropped all of his gear on the ground after finishing his water. At this point, he would have known that if he doesn't find a water source soon, he won't make it. And so Bryce just continues to trudge along on this dry riverbed, not seeing any indication that he's getting any closer to water. But then he looks up and he sees the land in front of him appears to slope downward out of view. And then beyond that, he sees off in the distance what looks like the southern wall of the Grand Canyon. And below the southern wall is the Colorado River. And so Bryce would have known if he can just go down this decline, he's certain to reach this river and he'll be saved. And so Bryce made his way up to where the ground started going down towards the river, and he began safely descending fairly slowly. And then he reached a very steep section called a spill, which is a dry waterfall. And these vary in height, but they're pretty steep and they're pretty slick. Once Bryce went down one of these things, there'd be no way to get back up again. So this was a one-way trip. But Bryce was desperate. He knew his only chance was getting down to that Colorado River, which he could now see. And so Bryce scrambled down this first spill, and then he found another one, and he kept going down these spills, and they kept getting steeper and more challenging, and the temperature continued to rise as he went down deeper into this canyon. Finally, Bryce reached a spill that was very, very steep, and it was nearly vertical. But again, Bryce couldn't go back up the way he came. He had to keep going. So at some point, he threw himself off of the spill and he fell down 30 feet, but he lived. He stood up, he dusted himself off, and he continued walking forward. He walked past these boulders into this clearing, and right in front of him is the Colorado River. It's a half a mile straight down in front of him. But the only way to get to it was navigating another spill. And this spill was 80 feet tall, and it was almost completely vertical. There was no way to survive that kind of fall. And Bryce couldn't just turn around and try to find an alternate route because this was a one-way trip. He could not climb back up the spills he had just come down to get there. And to his left and to his right were these steep canyon walls that kind of bordered the space he was in that had no handholds on them, so he couldn't climb them up or down. Bryce was trapped, and he knew it. The following Tuesday, when Bryce was supposed to be home in Virginia visiting his family, he didn't show up. So his family tried calling him, but they couldn't get through to him. It seemed like his phone was off, and so they called the authorities. A search party was sent out in the Grand Canyon to go look for Bryce, and on Saturday, July 25th, so this is 6 days after Bryce has found himself trapped on that ledge overlooking the river, a search party was on the Colorado River, and they happened to look up in the direction where Bryce had been, and they noticed what looked like a person, and so they got their climbing gear, and they made their way up that spill onto this ledge, and they found Bryce. He was sitting up against a boulder, and he was deceased. He had died from heat stroke and dehydration. In his hand was his BlackBerry cell phone. It wouldn't have had any service inside of the canyon, but Bryce used it as a notepad to write a final message to his family and to his friends. In it, he writes, "Life is good whether it is long or short. I was fortunate to do much more than most people, and for that I am very thankful." His message also had some humor thrown into it. He said to his family that he was really thankful he had his BlackBerry phone because it would have been a lot harder to etch his final message into a rock. He also said that he didn't know what the afterlife held for him, he just hoped they had water. Then, with his phone's battery dying, he wrote one final sentence. "I feel like going into the wild is a calling we all feel. Some answer it, and some die for it." Then, shortly after writing that message, Bryce clutched his phone to his chest and he passed away. He was just 20 years old. Amongst all the special operations units in the entire world, there are a handful of units that are better than everybody else. And one of them is the United States Navy SEALs. Now, I'm a little bit biased because I was a Navy SEAL from 2012 to 2017, but just objectively speaking, the amount of money that the United States Navy invests into creating one Navy SEAL is approximately $1 million. Now think about that from a military standpoint. The military is like the ultimate bureaucracy, where it's all about kind of mass producing solutions. But with the Navy SEAL teams, it's kind of like the opposite, where this big bureaucracy is spending all this money and time to identify individuals that on their own merits are going to be the solution. And in order to be identified as one of those individuals, you need to go through arguably one of the most difficult military selection programs in the entire world. And if you make it to the very end of the 1.5 to 2 year long process of becoming a Navy SEAL, one of the last things you have to do before you can actually put a trident on your chest and be a Navy SEAL is go through a course called SERE School. SERE stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. They're going to teach you how to handle being captured by the enemy, and more specifically, being tortured by the enemy. Much of SERE School is done in the classroom, but the famous part of SERE School is done in the field. Now, before I get into anything to do with the field exercise, just know that I can't really talk in detail about it because a lot of it is actually sensitive information. So I'm going to be speaking in generalities about the course, but you'll get the gist and you will appreciate the audio recording. After you finish the classroom portion of SERE School, you move on to the kind of final training exercise or field exercise. And that's where they simulate you being behind enemy lines and getting captured, and you need to basically show your instructors that you don't just crumble, that you actually can handle the stress and the pressure and the mistreatment. There are segments of the field training exercise where you are put into very stressful positions, you're sensory deprived, and you have to listen to a particular audio recording. It is the Boots poem by Rudyard Kipling, and anybody that's been through Navy SERE School knows exactly what that poem sounds like, because you listen to it over and over and over and over and over. It is maddening. I mean, maddening. I put it on for this video and listened to it. I had to turn it off. It's seriously awful. And so just imagine listening to this for like, I don't want to give any times away, but it's an extremely long amount of time that you're just listening to this in this tight little space and you're all cramped up. It's awful. It really is. So here you go. Have a listen to the official torture song of the Navy SEAL teams.
So bad by day because the company, but night brings long strings of 40,000 million hoops, 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 moving up and down again. There's no discharge in the war. What? We have put slogging over Africa.
In 2013, a Reddit user was having a hard time getting to sleep, and then they would wake up in the middle of the night and their sleep was just generally broken, and so they decided they would look into downloading a sleep app. She wound up settling on a particular app called Sleep as Android because not only would it give her a whole bunch of information about her night's sleep, but it also had a constant recording going over the course of the night, and anytime it picked up an anomaly in sound, like snoring or talking in your sleep, it would record it and then clip it and provide it to you the next morning and show you these highlights of your sleeping from the night before. So she downloads the app, and starting on October 1st, 2013, she begins dutifully turning this thing on before she goes to bed. And then the next day she would get up, she'd review her sleep, she'd read all the graphs, she'd get all the reports. But the thing she wound up being the most interested in was this little timeline of all these instances where she would snore or make a funny sound. And it was just interesting because you don't get to listen to yourself sleep because, well, you're sleeping. But starting in November, so a month after downloading it, she started noticing that the app was picking up this strange clicking sound. It didn't have a consistent cadence to it. It almost sounded like someone had dropped something on the ground, but it was really difficult to discern it as something specific in the room. And so she assumed it had to be like the string on the fan, because some nights her fan was on, some nights it was off. And when it was swinging, maybe it was rattling the fan and the chain was bumping into the side of the frame, or it was just something else in her room. It didn't strike her as a very meaningful sound, but she was at least starting to be aware of this sound. Over the next couple of weeks, she heard the sound a couple more times, not while she was sleeping, just the next morning when she would see it on her app. And she actually started trying to recreate the sound by turning on the fan and actually shaking the fan to try to get the string to bounce up against the side in hopes that that would be the sound.
But despite listening really intently for this sound, she just could not duplicate it and just didn't know where it was coming from. But again, she's not concerned, she's just a little bit perplexed. Then on December 30th, 2013, so this is about 3 months after downloading it, she's had about a month and a half of hearing these clicking sounds. She wakes up and she sees on her app's timeline, there's a whole bunch of audio recordings, but there's one particularly loud recording that took place at 2:04 a.m. earlier that morning. She loads it up and she starts hearing those clicking sounds that she had grown accustomed to hearing, but then she hears herself sit up in the bed and say, "What are you doing?" And then there's a pause, and then a male voice says back to her,
"Nothing."
And then you hear some more clicking, and you hear that same voice say,
"That's them."
And so right after hearing this recording, the Reddit user is like, "Oh my God, was someone in my house?" And she runs around the house, makes sure nobody else is there. All the doors are locked, all the windows are locked. There's no sign that anybody was in the house. Nothing's missing, at least nothing she can tell. The Reddit user's friend suggested, why don't you post it to Reddit and see if anybody can give you some insight into what this was. Out of the thousands of comments on there that were all over the map for what this could be, there was a speech expert that actually got in touch with the Reddit user and went through the audio with her and then had her send recordings to him as well as her son to try to see if it would be possible for her to make the voice. And the speech expert determined that it would be impossible for her or her son to have made the voice in the room, meaning someone else was in the room with her in the middle of the night. After this particular night, she never picked up another voice in her room with her, but she did continue to hear that clicking sound that she began to associate with whoever this person was that was in the room with her, and so she and her son ultimately moved. Here is the audio recording.
What are you doing? Okay. Okay.
In the late 1940s and 1950s, Reverend Jim Jones was known for his charitable works and his efforts towards desegregating Indiana. This earned him a devoted, loyal following, in particular from the African American community. In 1956, he purchased a church in Indiana and he named it the People's Temple, and all of his loyal followers went there and joined his congregation. During his fiery sermons, Jones emphasized helping the poor and lifting up the downtrodden, but despite his best efforts, raising money was proving to be a big challenge for him. Jones knew he was an amazing performer and he was really good on stage, and so instead of trying to do all the old school church fundraising techniques, he decided to do something a little more new school that played to his strengths, which was performance. And so what he started doing is advertising that he could perform miracles, live miracles on stage. And specifically what he said he could do is he could pull cancer out of people. And he had this magic trick where he would go up to somebody that had cancer and he would appear to be pulling on them, and then he would pull out what looked like meat from this person. And it was meat, it was chicken meat. And he made it seem like he had removed the cancer, and people loved it, and his congregation swelled immediately and money was pouring in. And it was around this time that Jones began to realize the power of his own influence. He could make his followers believe anything he wanted. This power trip, though, over time would cause Jones to lose his grip on reality. And so when he began espousing fairly radical views, he didn't have anybody that was going to stand up and say, I don't know if you're right about that. Instead, he had a mass of people that basically blindly agreed with him. But when his social goals became so radical that they attracted Marxist leaders and violent leftist groups to the People's Temple, it was the one time that his followers said, okay, enough is enough. And there was a mass defection out of the People's Temple. And some of these defectors, when they left and had a chance to kind of look at the People's Temple for what it was, they realized it was more like a cult, and that they had been brainwashed, and that Jim Jones was a lunatic, and anybody who followed him could potentially be in danger. And so they went to the media and told them about this. The media converges on the People's Temple, and all of a sudden it's this huge scandal that Jim Jones is the leader of a cult. And as stories started to break about Jim Jones being this awful person who was stealing from his members and abusing them and brainwashing them, he up and leaves for South America with hundreds of his most loyal followers, and they resettle in an area called Guyana that would eventually be called Jonestown. Life on the Jonestown compound was very grim. Not only did they have 10-hour workdays every day of the week, but food and water were extremely limited because they were so cut off from modern society that the only way they could get any sort of resources was through haggling over a shortwave radio that usually didn't even work. So they're totally cut off, they have very few supplies, and then at the end of their 10-hour workday, it was mandatory for all members to come into this main area underneath this big scaffolding where Jim Jones would get up on stage and he would rant and rave about various government conspiracies that were going to befall them. He would excoriate defectors and talk about how they needed to round them up and make examples of them. And if you stepped out of line, even just a little bit, you could find yourself locked inside of a coffin or trapped at the bottom of a well as a form of punishment. Jones was already spiraling out of control, but some health issues led him to take a daily, near lethal dose of amphetamines and sedatives that made him a total lunatic. Suddenly, his nighttime speeches just weren't enough, and he began pumping these crazy speeches 24/7 over loudspeakers all over the camp. One defector said the speeches were centered on this idea that back in the United States, the government was systematically rounding up African Americans and sending them to concentration camps. And it was only a matter of time before they came here and took any of the African Americans here into captivity. And since the majority of the People's Temple were of African American descent, this was terrifying. U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan had been keeping close tabs on the People's Temple ever since the news broke about Jim Jones kind of being a hack and a maniac. And when they went to South America, he just felt like no one's really checking in on them, and I'm concerned for the well-being of the people that are there. And so on November 18th, 1978, Ryan, along with 18 other people, flew to Guyana to talk to Jim Jones and to make sure that everything was okay. When he arrived, he was expecting it to be kind of in disrepair and be this chaotic scene, but it wasn't. The camp was maintained, people were well-dressed, polite. It seemed like a happy and healthy community with a few hundred people there. And he actually went to Jim Jones and says, you know, it looks like you got a good thing going here. But Jones, in his totally delusional state, believed Ryan was being sent by the US government to round up the members and to ship them into concentration camps. And so as soon as the congressman left the camp and was headed back to the airport, Jones sent a security team after them and they shot and killed Leo Ryan along with 4 others. While that massacre is going on, Jones goes over to the middle of the camp where he normally gives his nighttime speeches, and he calls all 900 plus members to the middle of camp to listen to him. He turns on a recording device, he picks up his microphone, and he delivers a speech that would come to be known as the death tape. His famous first line of this speech is, "I've tried my best to give you a good life." And you can hear the crowd erupt with cheers as he says this, and what listeners of this tape can't see is what's being unveiled at the same time. Right next to Jim Jones is this silver cauldron of this sickly purple liquid, and next to it are about 900 cups. The next day, authorities are outside the gate of Jonestown, and they're getting ready to head into Jonestown to confront Jim Jones about his connection to the murder of Congressman Ryan and the 4 others. And they're loading their guns, they're getting ready for what's bound to be massive resistance from this crazy cult leader and his followers. And as they're making their way down the road and the camp comes into view, they notice that it's eerily quiet and they don't see anybody moving around. And as they're walking through some of the high grass, someone trips and falls, and they think they've stepped on a log. But when they stand up and look down, they notice that it's a dead person, and they scream out, and then everyone's looking around, and they notice that all over the ground in front of them are hundreds and hundreds of dead bodies. There's more bodies than they can possibly count. The previous night, that purple liquid that was revealed to the crowd after Jim Jones begins his speech was Kool-Aid mixed with cyanide. And over the course of several hours, and it's all recorded on the death tape, he encourages his members to come up and die with dignity and drink the Kool-Aid. However, if you didn't drink the Kool-Aid or didn't want to drink the Kool-Aid, like many of the 300 children, their parents would make them or the armed guards would come over and they would inject them with it. And after everybody's died, Jim Jones doesn't even drink from the Kool-Aid. He ends up shooting himself. I've decided to only include a very small portion of the death tape because so much of it is just it's heartbreaking, it's distressing, and it should be something that you decide you want to listen to. It should not be thrust upon you.
How very much I've tried my best to give you the good life. It was said by the greatest of prophets, from time immemorial, no man takes my life from me, I lay my life down. If we can't live in peace, then let's die in peace. We've been so betrayed. We have been so terribly betrayed. Take the portion like they used to take in ancient Greece and step over quietly, because we are not committing suicide. It's a revolutionary act. We can't go back. They won't leave us alone. They're now going back to tell more lies, which means more congressmen, and there's no way we can survive.
In the spring of 2020, right when the COVID-19 pandemic was really kicking into high gear, students at the University of Nebraska were told to move out of their dorms and move back home with their families to prevent the spread of the virus. One student, 20-year-old Alex Kearns, who was enrolled at Nebraska on an ROTC scholarship, was just as shocked as everybody else at how quickly this pandemic had turned their life upside down. But in terms of going back home again, he wasn't that upset about it because he was close with his family and he figured some unexpected time with them would be nice. Once he got back to his hometown of Naperville, Illinois, which is an affluent suburb outside of Chicago, he quickly fell into a quarantine routine, which consisted mostly of screen time and lounging around. But in the evenings, he would put his screens away and he would go into the kitchen with his mother, Dorothy, and the two of them would chat for hours about all sorts of things. One night, he told his mom that he was feeling kind of nervous about what he was going to do with his life after college, that even though he was studying business out at the University of Nebraska, he didn't really know what he was going to do with that. All he knew was that he wanted to find a way to help people. And his mother and everybody that knew Alex would say that that's just Alex. He was this really gentle, nice, awesome person that everybody just adored. After being home for a few weeks, Alex was starting to get bored of his quarantine routine, and he began looking for other things to do. He had seen a number of ads for a new brokerage app called Robinhood that was becoming increasingly popular amongst people his age. Unlike other trading platforms, Robinhood was designed for the common person. There was not huge fees that needed to be paid by the investor as soon as they logged on, and the app was very sleek, and it turned trading kind of into a game on the app. Alex had a few $1,000s in his bank account, and so he figured, you know what the heck, I'll download Robinhood and see what I can do. What's the worst that can happen? After trading on Robinhood for a couple of days, Alex was hooked, and he showed his family that he was actually making a little bit of money, and he was learning about the stock market. His parents would later recall when they found out he was using Robinhood, they weren't concerned because Alex had always been incredibly careful with his money, saving most of it and very rarely spending much of it, and so they figured, he might lose his savings, but he's certainly not going to fall into significant debt. That's just not Alex. Also, there was a safety mechanism in basic accounts on Robinhood that protected first-time users from going above $10,000 in debt. So even if Alex tried to lose more than that, the app wouldn't allow him so long as he was using a basic account. As the weeks went on, Alex got more and more confident in his trading ability, and he got really familiar with the Robinhood app. And one day he noticed there was one function he had not tried on the app called options trading. For context, traditional trading goes like this. Somebody identifies a stock that they like, and then they gamble on it. And the way they gamble on it is they buy shares of that stock, and if the stock increases in value, they make more money. If the stock loses value, they lose money. Very simple. But some people either can't afford the shares or don't want to buy the shares, but they still want to get in on the action of the stock market. And for those people, they can use something called options trading. Instead of buying shares, options traders will basically sell an insurance policy to other traders who have already purchased shares. And this insurance policy they're offering is known as an option. These option traders will go up to these shareholders and they'll say, for example, I'll give you $500 in exchange if your stock tanks and you're losing a ton of money. You can exercise your option, i.e. cash in your insurance policy, and I, the option holder, will cover all of your losses. But if your stock stays steady or gains in value,
I still get to keep your $500. That's non-refundable. Naturally, these options traders, they need to be savvy about which stocks they're prepared to cover with their option. Because if that stock tanks and the shareholder decides to sell, i.e. exercise their option, then the option holder is obligated to immediately buy all of the shares at a premium. And if that shareholder has, let's say, hundreds of thousands of shares, well, too bad, the option holder is buying all of them. So when Alex clicked on the options trading button inside of his Robinhood app, it brought him immediately to an application, because Robinhood had to make sure anybody on their app that was going to be buying or selling options, they needed to be an experienced trader, and they needed to understand the risks because they were much higher than a basic account. There was no limit to how much debt someone could fall into in trading options. Alex was a smart guy and a motivated trader, but he knew nothing about options trading. And so when he saw this application, I'm sure he thought to himself, yeah, I know nothing about options trading. There's no way I could possibly get into this. But he decided, you know, what the heck? I will apply to go onto their options trading side just to see if they'll accept me. And so he fills out the application, and almost immediately he is accepted onto that side of the platform. It would later turn out that application was kind of a sham. It did not really do very much to restrict access to that side. Alex was surprised at his acceptance, but he was also very excited. And right away, he started trading options, and he was pretty good at it. And pretty quickly, he was making a little bit of money. But then on June 11th, he got a notification on his phone from Robinhood. And so he pulled his phone up, he opened the app, and he saw his account was restricted. He couldn't make any new trades, and he couldn't make any withdrawals. And so as he looked at it, he scrolled down to the bottom of the page, and he saw his current balance, and it read negative $730,000. A trader that Alex had sold an option to was exercising his option because his stock had tanked, and he owned over $700,000 worth of shares that now Alex was obligated to buy. Alex couldn't believe what he was looking at, and he immediately fired off an email to Robinhood customer support saying there had to have been a mistake, that he had done the math before he had sold that option, and he thought at most he was exposed to losing maybe $10,000, certainly not $700,000. And so after he sent this email, a couple of minutes later, he got a message back from Robinhood, but it was just an automated response that just said, hey, we got your email and we're busy and we'll be sure to be in touch with you as soon as we possibly can. And so at this point, Alex is starting to panic a little bit because he's looking at his phone and this looks real. He's trying to go through his phone to find some place that would show him this was a mistake, but there's nothing that indicates this is a mistake. And so after a couple of hours, Alex is just laying in his bed, he can't sleep, and he sends another message to the customer support team at Robinhood, pleading with them to please check his account. There has to have been a mistake. There's no way I would have exposed myself to $700,000 of debt. But again, all he gets is an automated response that says, we're busy and we'll be in touch with you soon. A couple hours later at 3:26 a.m., Alex is still awake, probably pacing around his room, totally panic-stricken. And he looks at his phone and there's another email from Robinhood. And he's thinking, oh my goodness, thank you. Someone's gotten in touch with me to tell me this has been a horrible mistake. And so he opens his email and the header of the email is immediate action required. And what it was a notice for him to make his first payment on this enormous debt. It was going to be about $170,000 that he had to pay in the next couple of days. And if he didn't make this first payment, they would seek legal action against him. Alex was probably terrified, and also he was ashamed and didn't want to tell his parents. And so all alone in his room, he writes a third email to Robinhood, now straight up begging them, someone please look at my account. This has got to be wrong. But again, he just got the automated message. And so for the rest of the night, Alex probably laid on his bed thinking the world was just crashing in on him. He knew there was no way he could pay this enormous bill. And if he didn't pay it, he would either go to jail or hand it off to his family, which would financially ruin them. And just the idea of doing that to the people he loved made him sick. He just could not face that as one of his options. And so by the time the sun came up the next morning, Alex had come to a conclusion about what he was going to do. He started by pulling out his phone and pulling up the Robinhood app and screenshotting the dashboard that showed his enormous negative balance. And then he went on his laptop and he wrote a long letter to his family and he put it on his desktop so they would understand why he did what he was about to do. And then he left the house, hopped on his bike, and pedaled away. A couple hours later, a police officer arrived at the Kearns' household and he told them that their son, their brother, Alex, was unfortunately deceased.
he had thrown himself in front of a train. The family was beyond devastated. This caught them so completely off guard. It didn't make any sense. Alex was a happy, funny guy with plans for the future. He had shown no indications that he wanted to harm himself. It really just didn't make any sense. And so at some point that day, they went to his laptop, they opened it up, and there was that note he wrote. And in this letter, he explains to his family how he had fallen into this enormous debt on Robinhood. He attaches the screenshot that showed his huge negative balance. And he said it was just crazy that this company would allow a 20-year-old with no income to be exposed to over $700,000 of debt. He thought that was crazy, but he admitted he didn't know that much about options trading and probably shouldn't have been accepted into their program to begin with. And then he tells his family that he did want to live, but unfortunately, this was the only way he could get out of this problem without inflicting enormous financial penalties on his family. And so he believed he was protecting his family when he took his life. 24 hours later, Robinhood sent Alex another email, and it said, "Oh, that $730,000 debt that we said you owed, that was a mistake. You don't owe anybody any money." Alex's family has since filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Robinhood, saying that had they just had a person working their customer service desk, they could have talked to Alex and immediately seen that this was a mistake, and it would have saved Alex's life. Their case is still ongoing. So
my screen glows brighter than the morning light. Another notification steals another night. Everybody's running, chasing something new. I stop for a second, asking what is true. A calendar packed from the start to the end. Always connected, but I miss my friends. 1,000 voices filling up the air. Still feels like silence everywhere. Just one moment, put the world aside. Just one moment, let my heart.
Every glance a sweet refrain. Together we'll remain, remain, remain. Moonlight glow, so bright, so true. Hey, hey, shining down on me and you. In your eyes I see the spark. Love ignites here in the dark, dark, the dark. Dance, dance under the stars. Hearts align, near and far. Feel the rhythm, feel the light. We own the night, the night.
that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer to buy the like button in order of their favorite food, fried chicken. But before you give it to them, remove the outer crispy layer from all of the pieces. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all